Everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be getting started in just a couple of minutes here. But while folks are getting logged in, I'd love to tell you about some upcoming courses. On Wednesday, April 19th, we'll be having a free webinar on job rotation, considerations for preventing musculoskeletal disorders with Drs. Mark Shaw and Alexander Vanel, and the Deep South Center for Occupational Health and Safety. Our next industrial hygiene themed webinar will be on Tuesday, May 9th. And the topic is occupations at risk for vector-borne diseases with Dr. Wayne Sanderson and the Central Appalachian Regional Education and Research Center. And on Tuesday, May 2nd and Wednesday, May 3rd, the California Labor Lab will be hosting their annual symposium. This year's theme is surveillance, monitoring, and data gathering in contemporary employment. Registration is free to attend or $49 for continuing education credit. For more about these events, you can visit us at coeh@berkeley.edu/about-CE. And on behalf of education and research centers throughout the country, it's my pleasure to present the Industrial Hygiene webinar series. This is a collaborative effort on behalf of each ERC's continuing education program and aspires to provide access to current research supported through NIOSH ERC programs. Thank you all for being here with us. Today's webinar, Protecting Workers from the Danger of Heat, Evidence-Based Approaches to Heat Stress Management, is brought to you by Dr. Margaret Morrissey and the New York, New Jersey Occupational Safety and Health Center. A few housekeeping items. You will be muted during this presentation. If you'd like to ask a question, please enter it into the online Q&A box. We'll save time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health YouTube page. And all participants who logged in today with their registration email for the full live presentation will receive a link to the evaluation tomorrow, and that will qualify you for a certificate of completion with one continuing education contact hour. Once you complete the evaluation, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome our presenter today, Margaret Morrissey, PhD. Dr. Morrissey is the Director of Occupational Safety at the Corey Stringer Institute and President of the Heat Safety and Performance Coalition, a new division of the Corey Stringer Institute. Recently, Dr. Morrissey led a 51 expert roundtable on occupational health safety, which resulted in a heat safety consensus document with 40 recommendations to protect the health and safety of workers. She has been invited to speak about heat safety at many safety events and conferences, currently serves as the secretary of the Thermal Stress Working Group at the American Industrial Hygienists Association, and is a subcommittee member of the American Society of Safety Professionals A1050 Heat Stress Construction Voluntary Standard. She was also asked to serve on the Gatorade Sports Science Institute expert panel on physically demanding occupations. She's consulted with numerous organizations and companies to improve their heat stress management plans, and it's our pleasure to hear from her today. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Michelle. I appreciate the introduction. Hello, everyone. It's so great to speak to you all today. As Michelle had mentioned, my name is Margaret Morrissey, and I am currently at University of Connecticut, specifically working at the Corey Stringer Institute, which is a nonprofit housed at the University of Connecticut. And today I'm going to talk about protecting workers from the dangers of heat. There we go. And so today's talk is going to be focused on first talking about the negative effects of heat stress on health, safety, and productivity. We'll then talk about some considerations related to the federal heat stress standard, which I'm sure all of you are aware of. And we're going to talk about prevention strategies that you should consider in your heat stress management plan. And then finally, we're going to talk about emergency procedures for heat-related emergencies, and that would specifically be referring to exertional heat stroke. And so many of you are certainly aware climate change is occurring, and because of that, it's increasing the frequency, duration, season, and intensity of heat waves. So during the 2020s, the average heat wave has been about 2.3 degrees Fahrenheit above the local threshold. And you can see in the figures outlined on the slide that since the 1960s, frequency, duration, season, and intensity has progressively increased. So not only is heat stress an issue, it's an issue that isn't going to go away, and unfortunately going to get worse. So definitely something that needs to be considered in terms of an occupational hazard. And so there are many effects that heat stress can have on health and safety, some of which can be a heat-related illness, fall and injury risk, dehydration, cardiac strain, kidney strain, and in the very severe cases, it can result in organ damage and low heat tolerance. And so this typically occurs in individuals who have suffered an exertional heat stroke. They then caused organ damage and then have complications due to the organ damage that they suffered from. And so one thing I really like to highlight for individuals is that when you're looking at the data that currently exists, we specifically look at OSHA reported data, and we see that the heat illness or heat-related illness numbers appear typically low. So if you're looking at, for example, OSHA reported data from 2011 to 2019, there's about 3,500 heat-related illnesses per year. And so again, that may seem to be relatively low compared to other hazards. However, as mentioned before, heat can cause a lot of different outcomes, right? It can cause cardiac events, it can cause kidney damage. And so one study that I really like to highlight that's actually from University of California was they were looking at specifically worker compensation claims. And they found that when they're looking at that and looking at environmental temperature, they found that there was an additional 20,000 heat-related workplace injuries in California alone. And so Public Citizen, which is an advocacy group for workers, then took that data and extrapolated it for the US and found that per year, there's about 170,000 heat-related injuries and illnesses that may not, immediately be recognized because of the intense effects that heat has and results on other outcomes besides heat-related illness. And so essentially, if you're looking at taking that extrapolated data and you're looking at number of days away from work, if we count for the 170,000 numbers, that can fall in the top 3 cause of injury, which is quite significant, below overexertion and falls on the same level. And I already mentioned this before, but I really like to state this every time I speak to anyone, is that the effects of heat are so much more than just heat illness. Yes, of course, heat illness is a really important consideration, but heat can cause impaired cognitive function, impaired neurological performance, that can then cause increased accidents and injuries. It can cause cardiac events, kidney strain. So really, really important to consider the wide array of negative effects that it can have. And also heat stress has been shown to influence productivity. So a lot of employers are very interested in making sure that, certain prevention strategies that are implemented aren't going to take away from certain working conditions or activities and impact economic growth. And so heat stress has been shown through hyperthermia, increased thermal discomfort, and increased sweating, which you can see on the figure here. That can all cause impaired cognitive performance, dehydration, psychological distress, time off task, and really decreased physical work capacity. So not only, during the work environment are workers having a lower work capacity, but there's more workers who aren't coming to work because of certain, injuries or illnesses that may be associated with heat. So again, an important consideration. And so because of the wide array of effects that heat stress can have on workers, the Department of Labor then recognized that heat is an issue and workers are considered a vulnerable population. And so in 2021, September, the Biden administration then mobilized to protect workers and communities from extreme heat. And so what began was the advance notice of proposed rulemaking on heat illness prevention in outdoor and indoor settings. And so my organization that I work for, the Corey Stringer Institute, we, responded to their call with 56 pages with recommendations because we felt, we wanted to make sure that the best practices are in consideration when implementing this federal heat stress standard. And so really since 2021 September, there has been an immense ripple effect ever since, the Department of Labor and OSHA has announced the potential for the heat stress standard. So I don't think everyone has seen this as a new hazard. I think everyone, has recognized that it can be an issue, but really have recognized that it's time to mobilize and provide action to be able to protect workers much more proactively. And so organizations such as AHA, ASSP, ISCA have created working groups and voluntary standards and things of that nature to be able to make sure in the meantime, we're protecting workers to our greatest ability. And so it was quite timely when we published a consensus document. It was actually in September 2021. So timely in terms of when the Biden administration announced the start to the federal heat stress standard. And so what we had recognized as even before, this announcement, that there was a lot of information in terms of governing bodies providing recommendations for, safety professionals and employers to protect their workers. But a lot of the feedback we are getting from safety and health professionals was, yes, this is, probably effective, but I don't know how to implement it into my everyday work site. I don't know specifically what categories of prevention strategies to focus on. And so because of this gap, we then, got a 51 expert panel together during a roundtable meeting, and we essentially came up with recommendations that were across a wide array of prevention strategies to provide these evidence-based, feasible, and clear recommendations that can serve as a foundation across different industries. And so if you're interested in this publication, it's in GeoHealth, and the 51 experts that I was speaking of are from very many different disciplines related to occupational heat stress. So we had scientists, representatives from governing bodies, worker health advocacy members, safety managers, clinicians. And so all of them essentially got together and we systematically scored every single recommendation. And there was 40 of them in the final document for all three categories that I had mentioned. So that would be the evidence-based, feasible, and then also clear. And so within that document and what I'm going to talk about today, we had 8 different categories. So we had heat hygiene practices, which would essentially be activities that can improve your tolerance of heat. So education being one of them, which I'll touch on momentarily. There's also hydration, heat acclimatization, environmental monitoring, physiological monitoring, body cooling, textiles, and emergency action plan implementation. So I'm going to touch on not every single one, but most of them to really share what should be implemented in a heat stress management plan. And I forgot to mention earlier in the presentation that a big majority of my position at the Corey Stringer Institute is to really engage with companies and different organizations and go on site and review what they currently have in place and provide recommendations that are going to really fit their work site. So I'm hoping I can share some of that insight today. So as I mentioned, I'm going to start with education. So many are very aware that education is an important component to any, hazard, but specifically heat stress. But I think a lot of the times some of the content is very limited. And I think there's various content that in topics that need to be focused on when providing educational modules and platforms for workers and employees. And so some of that would be needs to touch on risk factors of heat-related illnesses and injuries, needs to talk about the effects of heat on health, safety, and productivity, as I had just mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Of course, the prevention strategies, first aid, and then how is someone going to respond, or how should they respond when there's an emergency. And so because more research dollars are being focused in the heat stress occupational space, it's really important to not only have this training during onboarding, but really to have the training annually. Because as I mentioned, as more money is being kind of focused in this area, we're learning new things, right? So we're learning what specific strategies are most effective. And so it could change from year to year. So it's really important to kind of stay on top of what the changes are to make sure you're implementing these best practices. And so, as I mentioned before, risk factors is really important to include in your educational platform. And so I wanted to mention some of the conditions, and this is not an exhaustive list, just some that may be associated with heat intolerance. So essentially someone's ability to work in the heat. And so sedentary lifestyle or low fitness level is a huge one. Diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, kidney disease, certain medications, obesity, all considerations for risk factors. And again, expanding beyond conditions, but focused on risk factors in general. So there's the obvious ones such as environmental conditions, low fluid consumption, sun exposure, but there's others such as previous illness. I think a lot of people don't recognize that if someone comes to the work site and they've had a cold or a respiratory infection days before, that can really affect their ability to tolerate the heat well. And like I mentioned before, low fitness is probably one of the biggest considerations. So individuals who are coming who are not fit are asked to perform unaccustomed work in the heat that they've never done before is a risk factor that needs to be considered. And so I'm going to touch on hydration. So I will say of all of the prevention strategies, I'd say hydration is the most focused on. And I want to absolutely say that hydration is a very important prevention strategy to include, but I want to be clear that it really isn't considered the most effective. Yes, it's part of the puzzle, but if you're only providing hydration strategies, you may not be able to, you're not affecting the heat load that your workers are being exposed to, or you're not, actually reducing their strain to a larger degree. So that's why strategies such as heatacclimatization, which I'll touch on momentarily, is really effective because you're, gradually exposing them to the heat. And so I just wanted to make that clear before talking about hydration, because when I look at these heat stress management plans, sometimes all I see are hydration recommendations. And so of course it's important, but there's a lot more to the puzzle. And so there's a huge prevalence of dehydration. 70% of workers arrive dehydrated. And so it's very prevalent. And so one thing I often don't see, which, should be mentioned in a heat stress management plan is, okay, I understand that hydration is important, but how do I even know if I'm dehydrated, right? Because a lot of the times health and safety professionals, well, all the time really, they don't know what's going on, outside of the work site. And so it's really important to provide that educational piece to let workers know when they're actually dehydrated. So to know when you're hydrated, look for urine color is a really good one. Urine color is not always the best depending on the circumstances. So for example, individuals who are using a porta-john aren't going to look at their urine color during that time. You can also pay attention to urine frequency, reduced thirst sensation, and body weight changes as well. And so I do want to highlight that this is current fluid intake recommendations by NIOSH. And so NIOSH very clearly explicitly states that the recommendations they provide are for heavy physical exertion and heat. So I want to make that known, because there is a condition that's resulting in too much hydration called hyponatremia. And so a lot of the times when these recommendations, you really need to be performing physically heavy work. And a lot of people ask me about electrolyte solutions. I would say that generally, if you're not in the heat performing heavy work, water is totally fine to provide. It's really when you get to that time point when you have heavy sweating and you're working really hard is when electrolyte solutions are important to consider. And so environmental monitoring. So for those of you who don't know or may not use it on your work site, it's essentially variables, meteorological variables, such as air temperature, airspeed, relative humidity, radiant heat. And so there's two sort of ways that environmental monitoring is often utilized. One, to create environment-based work modifications. So you're going to have those work to rest ratios. And then you can also have it as certain thresholds to be able to implement additional heat stress prevention strategies. And so there's a lot of different heat stress indices out there. I'm sure many of you have seen the gambit of what's out there. Some of the examples are wet bulb globe temperature, heat index, and those are the two popular ones. And so essentially wet bulb globe temperature, or WBGT, is characterized as the industry standard. And the reason being is it's essentially an equation derived from various different metrics, and these metrics specifically being air temperature, humidity, radiation. And it's different than heat index, whereas heat index is a heat balance model and it takes into account how you may be feeling. And so I like to recommend wet bulb globe temperature, especially for those outdoor workers or indoor workers who are exposed to different radiant heat sources, as an effective prevention strategy to utilize. And so I also get a lot of questions about, what do I even use to assess the environment? And there's a lot of different apps out there that can, provide this information, but I do want everyone to take a little bit of caution in terms of using the National Weather Service, not that one specifically, just in general app-based applications, because it may not be actually representative of your work environment. And so here's an example. This was actually done in athlete settings. So it was looking at wet bulb globe temperature in a comparison between the National Weather Service and different athletic surfaces. So, turf and black track, and wanting to see was the on-site wet bulb globe temperature, the same as what was being provided in the National Weather Service. Because remember, the National Weather Service could be the conditions that are miles away from what your work site may be, depending on your location. And so we did, in this particular study, they did see differences, right? So you can see it's anywhere from 0.6 degrees Celsius all the way to almost 2 degrees Celsius. So when you're talking about those wet bulb globe temperature thresholds, that could put you in a entirely different category. And if it's underestimating that, it can become a huge issue. So if you're able to, I highly recommend essentially performing environmental monitoring on site near your workers, so that you're getting the true environmental exposure that these individuals are, exposed to. And so heat acclimatization. And so on the opposite end of the hydration prevention strategy, I'd say heat acclimatization is the most underutilized. And I'm going to be honest, because there's not a lot of research out there. So not a lot of research in terms of what heat acclimatization protocol is effective depending on the industry. So a lot of the research that's coming from heat acclimatization is coming from the military or the sports world, but many of you know it's very different, right? The workers are different, the working conditions are different. So it's important for us to consider that. But for those of you who don't know what heat acclimatization is, it's essentially repeated bouts of physical work in the heat that then will, in its progressive and gradual exposure, and it will induce physiological adaptations that will then reduce strain and improve performance or thermal tolerance. And so heat acclimatization is for new workers that are, being exposed to this work environment and heat for the first time, but it also is workers who are returning from a prolonged absence. So this would be about over 2 weeks. It's not as aggressive in terms of a protocol for the workers who are returning back, but it is important for them to progress into the work conditions that they were originally used to doing. And so I already kind of mentioned this before. So the research out there in terms of heat acclimatization in the industry occupational space is pretty limited. And the adaptations that someone really achieves after a heat acclimatization protocol is really dependent on the frequency, their training status, the environment, the intensity. So again, it's not an easy answer, and it's very, very industry specific. Again, a lot of the stuff that I'm doing is really helping different industries or companies rather create their own heat acclimatization protocols that fit within their work environment and the population of workers that they have. And so this is specifically coming from the GeoHealth document that we have published. And so this is based on the NIOSH guidelines as well. So about a 10 to 20 increase in your work from, it can be essentially, you can focus on 1 to 5 days. That's typically the short acclimation that's most useful for the occupational industry sector. You can do 1 to 14 days, but that's typically not feasible. And so, like I mentioned, the re-acclimatization is a much faster than the initial one because you're already somewhat used to the conditions. But I do want to mention too that individual heat acclimatization protocols are also, and really the adaptations the workers are going to achieve are so dependent on the industry. So for example, if workers are performing the same activities every day, their acclimation to that, in the heat and that physical workload is going to be much quicker than someone who goes to different locations and is potentially performing something very new on a day-to-day basis. And so then I'll talk about physiological monitoring, and I'm sure no one is surprised that this is no pun intended, a hot topic right now. I think that a lot of the times people are interested in, individually measuring the physiological strain of workers, which I agree. I'm a physiologist. I love knowing how the heat is affecting the body. But before we really implement these physiological monitoring devices, there's a lot of considerations that need to be thought about before really determining this is the best prevention strategy to utilize. And so before you kind of, decide to implement that into a heat stress management plan, here's a couple questions you should ask yourself. One, what's the purpose of it? What do I want to get out of, measuring the physiology of the workers? Do we know how to interpret it? So I have, again, a lot of individuals that will come to me and say, oh, we just implemented this, new device that can measure X, Y, Z, but they don't know what to do with the data. And so often that's where I come in to kind of help them, be able to determine what this data actually means. It has to be team-based. A lot of athletes have these individual solutions, which are great, but you really need to have ones that you can measure multiple different workers, and also recognize you can't typically measure every single worker on your work site. And one of the really important things that I harp on constantly is that when you're, implementing a product or a device that measuring a certain, metric. So I'm just going to give core temperature as an example. Are you sure that it's actually measuring what it's intended to measure? So a lot of the times these different manufacturing companies will say that, this is measuring core temperature. But in reality, it's an algorithm that's then guessing what it could be. And so you just need to be really careful. And one of the ways to make sure it's actually measuring what it's intended to measure is by really focusing and looking at, was this device validated? And really, was it reviewed by an external third party? So a lot of the times manufacturers, will do their own internal validation, which is fine. But at the end of the day, it's really a lot of peace of mind having an external third party review it. So you have a lot of confidence that, hey, this is actually measuring what it's intended to measure. And I feel confident in putting this into my, heat stress management plan. And so why validation is so important, because physiological measurements and the devices that measure it change depending on the scenario. So sweat and heat, different, intensities of physical activity, anthropometric considerations can all change the accuracy of that actual device. And just an example of differences in validity is we actually, at the Corey Stringer Institute, we go to the Falmouth Road Race every year, which is a race that's done in Massachusetts that's focused, it's a 7-mile race, and we go there because there's a lot of heat strokes. And the reason why there's a lot of heat strokes is because the distance is 7 miles, so it's just enough to really push yourself, and it's a long distance, and it's in August, so people tend to get really hot. And so what we did was we measured the exertional heat stroke patients came into the med tent, and they got, utilized core temperature assessment to classify whether or not they're having heat stroke. And then we also put the oral or ear thermometry in their ear as well, because we wanted to see what's the difference in these two. Is these products that may be saying they're estimating core temperature actually doing it? And is it safe to utilize in someone who's having an exertional heat stroke? And scary enough, we found a very, very big difference. So it's about 4.3 degrees Fahrenheit difference between that core temperature, the real core temperature assessment, versus the ear thermometry. And so, and that difference got progressively bigger the hotter someone got. So again, really important to make sure that the things that are being measured are actually measuring what they're intended to measure. And so some of the recommendations that I provide for people that either, already implemented these physiological monitoring systems, are looking to do it, but want to do it, the right way and make sure it's measuring what it's intended to measure. I would recommend doing some sort of reliability, validity study in your work site. I know that's not feasible for everyone, but certainly consideration if the resources are available. And that would just be comparing a validated measure to the measure that the device is saying that's measuring or is measuring. And all you really need to know is the variability. So if there's a low variability, if there's high variability, then you don't have as much confidence, and you really don't want to make a safety decision based on that certain metric. And then, but if it's low, perhaps you can use it to make certain safety decisions. Maybe I'm just going to give an example. Someone's heart rate is really, really high and it's sustained for a long time. Maybe they should take a break. This shouldn't be utilized for medical diagnoses, of course, but it can help you make some safety decisions. And so another recommendation that may be a little bit more feasible is really comparing collected data from the device to, heat strain symptoms, perception of heat strain, productivity losses, and you can kind of create these alerting systems or thresholds from this data, which would be very helpful to do. So you're not just, utilizing a threshold that may not work within your work environment. Body cooling, again, another important one. There's a lot of different products out there, and there's a lot of different methods on how to cool the body. And so here's just a few examples: extremity cooling, fans, cooling vests, hand cooling, cooling towels, ice slushies. But there is a lot of considerations for body cooling that I think are really important to touch on. One being that in order for a body cooling modality or method to be really effective and to really change someone's core temperature, you need to have it really cold. That may sound obvious, but it needs to cover as much body surface area as possible. And so the reason being is the more body surface area is covered by that cool device, the more likely or increase you're going to have in their cooling capacity. And so a lot of the times too, individual companies are having their workers wear ice vests, which is fantastic. But the important thing too is they need to be switched out regularly. Eventually, if someone has an ice vest that's on for 8 hours, by 2 to 3 hours in, if that, it's not going to be working anymore, and it's just going to be extra load that person is carrying. And so in terms of what type of cooling modality is important for your work site, it really depends on the conditions of your work site. So do you have access to power? Do your workers wear PPE where they can take it off? Things to think about. And so the last section that I'm going to talk about is emergency action plans, but also the emergency procedures for exertional heat stroke. And so it's really important that every single work site has a heat specific emergency action plan, meaning that they know specifically what's going to be done if someone suffers a heat emergency or exertional heat stroke. And so this plan needs to be disseminated to all staff and reviewed by everyone, and really it should be created alongside with a medical professional to help really manage and coordinate this plan. And so one thing I quickly want to touch on as well is that a lot of industry and occupational groups rely on EMS for treatment, which is very appropriate because a lot of the times people don't have medical personnel on their work site. One really important thing to consider, and it's actually in a publication that we're hoping to get published soon, is that not all EMS guidelines across different states actually implement best practices for treatment of exertional heat stroke. So what you can take from this is really communicating with EMS and letting them know, what these best practices are. And of course, there's definitely EMS who are doing the best practices, doing it exactly correct, but it's an important consideration to know what's going on in the specific state you're in to make sure that they are doing that, because that could save a life. So very important. And so last bit I'll talk about is, okay, I've harped on you need an emergency action plan, but what do you actually have in it? So what are the emergency procedures for exertional heat stroke? And so I think I'll just briefly mention that a lot of times we think of prevention as one thing. So we think of preventing a heat-related injury or illness from happening in the first place. So you can see on the left side here, that could be work to rest ratios, environmental monitoring, hydration. But then we often forget about the second level of prevention. And so this is really the prevention of a fatality, right? So we all know that not every single plan is going to be 100% fail-proof. So we have to be able to be prepared and recognize and treat exertional heat stroke if it's to occur on the work site. And so for emergency procedures of exertional heat stroke, cold water immersion is the gold standard. The reason being is the individual is entirely in water and ice, and essentially that's going to enhance the cooling capacity and therefore reduce their temperature. EHS, or exertional heat stroke, is identified through an assessment of core temperature. But one, if you take nothing from the presentation, particularly related to exertional heat stroke, please remember this, that the number one goal for someone who is having an exertional heat stroke is to get their body temperature down within 30 minutes. So as quickly as you can. And the reason being, I'll go back to that slide, but this is important. The reason being is because there's complications that come with an increased time frame of delayed response or delayed cooling. So if someone is to be cooled aggressively within 30 minutes of collapse, they will survive without complications. But then as that, 30 minutes starts to increase, that's when you get to the long-term complications, permanent complications, or even death. And so the signs and symptoms of exertional heat stroke are, of course, like I mentioned, core temperature, so extreme hyperthermia, greater than 105 degrees Fahrenheit, but it's also altered consciousness, disorientation, confusion, and we call these central nervous system dysfunction. And so for those of you who don't have a medical professional on site, it's really important to utilize and know these signs and symptoms, because you won't be able to actually assess what their core temperature is, but perhaps you can see that, this person is acting very bizarre. They may have some altered consciousness, confusion. So really important to know those. And there's other, symptoms as well, such as dizziness, nausea, staggering, everything that's on this slide right here. And so this is actually the last slide that I have. And so I know I had mentioned that cold water immersion is the gold standard, and I would definitely recommend, if you're on a remote work site where you're not able to have a cold water immersion tub, potentially transport to somewhere that does until EMS arrives. But again, not all situations are able to do that. So there are alternative measures that, or treatment methods you can utilize if someone is suffering from an exertional heat stroke. And so one of them is, I can see on the right side, the Polar Life Pod has really significant cooling rates, but it's relatively big. There's also what we call the TACO method, which is the TARP assisted cooling with oscillation. And this is, you can see on the left side, the individuals in the TARP, water and ice, and you move back and forth to make sure the water is circulating around them. I will mention that for both of the two that are in the pictures here, it's important to know, circulate the water and have someone who's, aware that it's really important to circulate water and have, and know these protocols. So if there really isn't anyone there, to do that, using ice towels covering the entire body is a strategy that you can utilize. Yes, it's not going to have as big of a cooling effect as cold water immersion would have, but what you can do is have, a bucket of water and ice, lots of towels, and put the towels all over their body. And the important piece is to really replace frequently. So because their skin is so hot, the towels will get really hot quickly. So you need to continuously dunk it, in the water and make sure that the skin is, or the towel on the skin is remaining cold, so that you can cool them effectively. And so that is my talk today. If you have more questions or have any specific questions about your own heat stress management plan, please feel free to contact me, Margaret Morrissey at UConn.edu. We also have a website, heatsafetycoalition.com. And then of course my social, because everyone's on social, but I'm more than happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much for this very excellent presentation and all of the information. We do have a number of questions already in our Q&A here. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. If you did ask a question in the chat and you haven't entered it in the Q&A, I recommend you move it over to the Q&A just to make sure that I don't miss it. That would be very helpful. So thank you in advance. Our first question, right now, before a national heat standard, what would you tell small employers that they need to do to protect their employees?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself for a second. Yeah, that's a really good question. I think one of the things that's not often talked about, because I think a lot of the strategies focus on having, a lot of resources, right? And maybe small companies don't have the same accessibility to that. So what I would say is a couple different things to focus on is to, like I mentioned, heat acclimatization is the most effective, I would say, prevention strategy, especially because there's an increased risk of heat-related injury and illness, particularly in the first 3 days of work. So having a progressive exposure to the workday, so maybe they work, 20% of a full workday the first day, increase 20% the next, and have that slow progression is one thing I would definitely think about doing. And it may be, not one thing that is, immediately recognized by everyone, but I think it's worth pursuing. And as long as you, divide it based on time of day and say, okay, 20% of the day, they'll do this and that, it's a little bit easier and more feasible to implement. And then the other sort of low hanging fruit, I would say, would be accessibility to cool water, and especially ice and water, and having some sort of, maybe body cooling towel they can dip in different water and ice to be able to do that. Because not only, from both hydration and body cooling is important in terms of making sure core temperature doesn't increase, but it also helps with perception. Workers are going to feel better, and they're going to, want to work more, not be feeling like they're having a horrible day. So I think those are like the three that are important to implement, and easier to implement than potentially like environmental monitoring maybe.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Do you find hygrometers, I might have said that wrong, as an effective alternative to WBGT monitoring devices? And how might you compare the two in terms of strengths and weaknesses?
Yeah, sorry, what was the first device?
Hygrometers, HYGRO meters.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to be honest, I'm not even really familiar with that. Just because I think mainly because I'm such a strong advocate for wet bulb globe temperature. And so I can't really speak a lot to the strengths limitations of that device specifically, but what I can speak to is the benefits of wet bulb globe temperature. And that is because it accounts for radiant heat load, which I think oftentimes is forgotten. And I'm sure many of you are aware that it can really increase the thermal strain that's exposed, our workers are exposed to. So I think because it's an equation that utilizes actual weather metrics to, determine a value, it's really important to use. If someone's utilizing heat index, particularly, I always speak to those because they're two that are most commonly used. It may be fine depending on the environment if you don't have a intense radiant heat load, but again, it's very individual to that work site and the environmental conditions within that work site. Sorry, I wish I had more to answer to that question, but
no, thank you. And we do have a lot of questions, so I'll do my best to get to as many as we can today. Thank you for such an engaged audience. This is great.
Yeah.
Do you have any specific types of heart rate monitors you recommend?
Yeah, so so the one that I utilize the most, well, I think I utilize Polar for and I feel like it's a very, it's just, if you type in Polar, I'm sure many of you have heard of it, is a very, I utilize a lot in the research space because I feel like it's validated and it's been utilized across many different work environments. So if I, had to recommend one, there's certainly more than that. And there's many different softwares as well that will utilize heart rate along with different metrics. So I don't want to say one particular product, but that would be my recommendation. The important thing to consider is that there's a lot of heart rate monitors that don't have the team-based software, so you can't like review many different people. Polar does have that, so they use the team. They have like it's Polar Team Pro is really nice, and it can be able to observe more than one person. But I would say that's what I would utilize if I had to.
Thank you. We also have a couple of questions regarding like data kind of sharing, compliance. If you're measuring core temperatures, if you're measuring folks' heart rate, what kind of data protection / potentially HIPAA issues might you run into?
Yeah, so I think that question is very, very individual to the particular industry. Like it's a question I get all the time, honestly, because, and I don't know, I think it's in terms of HIPAA data, I don't think it really has really an association because it's not technically medical data. So in terms of that, I'm not sure you would run into a lot of, barriers. However, I don't know explicitly everyone's work environments and the company itself. So I think that really depends. But what I would say is that if you're utilizing these physiological monitoring systems, to be able to make sure that the data isn't tied to personal information is important. So a lot of the times people will not have devices that are particularly to that person. They'll pick one up for the day and that's theirs, and they have a number, and then you have no connection to who wore what as well. So that can be helpful. The only problem with that is if you're looking back at data because you want to look at trends, it makes it a little bit harder to do. So just some considerations if that's an issue.
Excellent, thank you. Another question, Oregon's heat regulation requires the employer to put together an acclimatization program for workers. I think they might be the first state to require this. If you are familiar with that regulation, do you have an opinion on it? And if you aren't, what's your opinion on the NIOSH criteria, acclimatization protocol?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I will say, and I already mentioned in my presentation, that there isn't a lot of research on any heat acclimatization protocols. So in terms of the effectiveness and actually looking at data that I don't want to say confirms, but like suggests that it's very effective in achieving adaptations, I don't know. But I think in the meantime, while we're waiting for that, evidence to get there and having more research to be able to look at the effectiveness of different strategies, I think the NIOSH criteria is a great recommendation. But I definitely think we're at the beginning stages of many different heat acclimatization protocols that may be very effective. It's just the research needs to get there, and that's what I'm planning on working on. So
awesome. So stay tuned for further research updates.
Yeah, exactly.
Great. We actually have a couple of questions regarding cooling gloves and palm cooling.
Okay.
One question about whether you're familiar with Professor Craig Heller's work at Stanford regarding the cooling glove, which cools the body rapidly through the hands via the veins.
Mm-hmm.
And also kind of a second question is, can cooling of the palms help with fatigue resistance and increased performance?
Yeah, so I think I have heard of that work, and I think that a lot of different cooling devices out there are focusing on, the hand for a cooling modality because of, because of that increased blood flow and the capillaries in the hand. I think that it's still, if you're trying to implement something that's really easy to do, hand cooling, may be really effective depending on how cold the device may be. But I think if you are provided the opportunity to increase more than just this, surface area here, I think that's going to be way more effective for you. And so even if you had some sort of hand cooling and having some sort of like ability to have like a vest or something like that is just going to enhance the cooling capacity to a much larger degree. But I have heard of it, and it is definitely a modality that's utilized.
Yeah. And thinking about emergency action plans, how do you know how quickly a worker will transition from heat syncope to heat stroke?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And this is actually, it's kind of like a myth that I'll debunk right now. Because I hear it all the time, is that with heat illnesses, it actually isn't progressive in nature. So what I mean by that is it doesn't go from heat syncope to heat exhaustion to heat stroke. So someone could have a heat stroke with having absolutely no symptoms of heat syncope or heat exhaustion. So that's really important to remember. And so I'm sorry, I totally forgot what the specific question was. I just got so excited.
Oh, yes. It was about the progression from.
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, so that progression may not be there. So what I always tell individuals, and this is advice that the medical professionals that I work with have given to me, is that when you're trying to distinguish between a heat exhaustion and a heat stroke, so heat stroke is the medical emergency that needs to be treated immediately. Essentially, if you bring someone to shade and they sit in the shade, they have water, and they start to look better, then you're like, okay, it's heat exhaustion because they're getting better. But if you bring somebody to the shade or a cool area and they don't get better, they're starting to look worse, or they're just maintaining their level of whatever they're at, then that's like a cue for you to say, oh no, this is a problem. So what I would do is rely on those signs and symptoms rather than kind of looking at it from a progressive perspective of, oh, this is going to happen before this is going to happen, because heat strokes look differently for everybody.
Thank you so much. Do you know if there's any type of physical conditions, for example, diabetes, hypertension, et cetera, that qualify for accommodations when the temperature rises?
That's a really, really good question. And I am actually not aware if that can happen or if that's even been a consideration. But I am curious to know, so I'll have to look into that.
This is kind of a similar vein question, but can heat stress exacerbate other medical conditions like cardiovascular anomalies, et cetera?
Yes, absolutely. So, that's one of the things I like to harp on all the time, is that a lot of the times heat stress will put a lot of stress on your cardiovascular system and other systems within your body. And so that increased stress and if you have an underlying condition especially, can be really detrimental for that individual. So that's why it's really important, if someone does have cardiovascular disease or diabetes, to recognize that heat stress is an issue, and to be able to prepare themselves or their workers for high heat conditions.
Thank you. Continuing on this train, when we think about the difference between study cohorts, most standards are designed for healthy populations, whereas many people might be compromised because of illness, disease, age, medications. How can we level the playing field to protect various vulnerable populations of workers?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And unfortunately, going along with the same, lack of research, we really don't have a ton of research out there in terms of what degree to which certain conditions will, experience increased strain compared to healthy ones, and especially how that translates to standards. So I think the best thing to do is to take the conservative approach. So like lower thresholds, and thinking about it from that aspect. I realize that's very difficult to do. But I'm not sure we have a good recommendation at this time. And so one of the things I would, as I mentioned before, is because we have individuals from different, health conditions and, different individual characteristics, heat acclimatization and slow progressive exposure is even more important, because then at least we know that wherever we're meeting the person where they're at, and we're essentially slowly getting them used to their, environment that they're going to be working in.
Awesome. And do you have any recommendations for a temperature in which it's like, nope, you know what, workers should not be allowed to work, acknowledging that humidity is also a factor?
Yeah, so I think it depends on your geographical location. So individuals who are in southern states may be able to, experience higher wet bulb globe temperatures than someone in the Northeast, because they're so much more used to that higher heat loads. So I'm not sure who sent the question, but I'm more than happy to share actually an article that's really interesting, and it talks about the different wet bulb globe temperature thresholds across different geographical locations. So definitely shoot me an email, and I'm happy to share.
Awesome, thank you. And I guess our last question for today, we do have a question. We have a lot more that I didn't get to, so sorry in advance, but thank you all so much for such an engaging Q&A session here. But a closing question, what are your thoughts on cold shock from cold water immersion? Is this a higher risk during heat stress?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that's one of the reasons why people are so reluctant to do cold water immersion. But I think it's really important to recognize that the cold shock is very rare to occur. And if it were to occur, it's going to happen in someone who has, severe cardiac issues. But if that individual is having a heat stroke anyways, you're still going to have to treat them for heat stroke. So I try and, emphasize that the occurrence of that cold shock and having it result in a negative outcome is very, very low. So I wouldn't, think about that in terms of, whether or not to put someone who's suffering from a cold water immersion in a tub, because at the end of the day, it's very unlikely that they would experience that.
Well, thank you so much for this incredibly informative presentation, all the research and resources that you shared with everyone today. Thank you to all of you who joined us, who participated in this webinar. We appreciate you being here. We appreciate your questions. A reminder, this presentation was recorded. I'll be putting this presentation as well as any additional resources on our website. So I recommend you check back to the link that you used when you signed up for today's webinar. You'll also get an email tomorrow with a direct link to that page. So be on the lookout for an email from us tomorrow. And thank you all again for being here. It's special thank you to you, Dr. Morrissey.
Thank you. Thanks for attending.
I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye.